to everyone who's here. I'm Becca Cantor, Jewish Book Council's editorial director, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to the final meeting of Paper Brigade Short Story Club this year. As you might know, as you probably know, Paper Brigade is Jewish Book Council's annual literary journal, and it celebrates the breadth and diversity of Jewish books today through a mix of articles, interviews, fiction, poetry, and artwork. At each meeting of our short story club, we discuss a work of fiction published in the journal together with its author, and today we're delighted to be joined by Abigail Weaver, the author of The Little Bottles. In addition to Abigail, I'm joined by Paper Brigade's fiction editor, Josh Rolnick, and executive editor, Carol Kaufman. The three of us will kick off the first half of today's meeting with some questions for Abigail, and for the second half, we'll invite you to jump in. If you'd like to ask a question, you can either raise your virtual hand or you can put your question in the chat. On the top right of your screen, you have the option of viewing the discussion in gallery or speaker mode, so you can choose whichever one you prefer, although I suggest speaker view because it might give you a slightly better view of Abby and all of us speaking. I also just want to remind you to mute yourself when you're not speaking. So Abigail's story appears in the 4th issue of Paper Brigade, so not the current issue, but our double 2020-2021 issue. We're posting a link to purchase that issue in the chat, and just until midnight tonight, we're offering you $5 off with the code short story. So it's now my pleasure to formally introduce Abigail Weaver. Abigail is a playwright, director, storyteller, scenic carpenter, and Yiddish translator who lives in Northampton, Massachusetts. She's also the co-founder of Theater Between Addresses, a theater company focused on developing new work by queer artists. Abigail, thank you so much for being here today. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited. Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Jewish Book Council, for having me.
Well, it's completely our pleasure. I'm extremely excited too. So I think to start off, I'd love to have you just summarize The Little Bottles in your own words.
Well, I think The Little Bottles is a love story, and it's a story that's a fairy tale that's not rooted in sort of Western European folklore, but rather a fairy tale that comes from Jewish folklore, and it sort of takes place in this small town, and it's a story that involves the two intertwined lives, and then the death of one friend, and then how that friendship continues and develops into love, and also has elements of rivalry and conflict, but mostly this love that just sort of blooms in different ways after death and then keeps evolving. I don't want to spoil it too much in case someone hasn't read it, but that's sort of my trailer for it.
True, exactly. Well, to give another little taste of your story, another little teaser, I wonder if you could read aloud the passage when, and this is a slight spoiler, but Hinda first experiments with leaving out a bottle of water to see if she can capture a soul in it.
Yes, I'll specify that particularly the folklore of the story, or maybe what you need to know to follow this passage, is that there's a particular piece of folklore that the story draws on that involves the leaving out of water on the Sabbath will cause a soul of a departed person who is flying around being tortured in Gehenna to come drop into the water on the Sabbath to cool off. So this child that we're about to meet in this excerpt hears about this piece of folklore and is very excited to figure out how this works. Here's the magazine that we were just discussing. Just before the Sabbath, Hinda stole an empty medicine bottle from her grandmother's bedside, uncorked it, and filled it with water. She stood it up under her bed and lay on the mattress stone still, listening to every creak and groan of the house, afraid to fall asleep and miss the arrival of a visiting soul. But then what if the soul saw her waiting and didn't come? What if she hadn't put out enough water? What if none of it was true after all? She drifted off after midnight, but woke before dawn, stirred by a weak glimmer emanating from under the bed. Clutching the cork in her fist, she peered down over the edge of the bed and saw something soft and beautiful drifting in the water, like the after image of a candle flame. She seized the bottle and slammed in the cork, sloshing the water inside. Frightened by her own boldness, she carefully put the bottle back down and retreated to the middle of her bed. She waited there sleepless until her mother called her for breakfast, and she went about her Sabbath day too afraid to look at the soul. The light was long in the afternoon when she built up the courage to kneel down and peek under the bed again. The soul seemed to be about 2 inches long, although where it really ended and began wasn't clear. It moved like fire flickering with warm light. It darted around, making ripples in the water, and when it bumped or brushed against the walls of its glass prison, it made a melodic clinking sound, like a ring dropped into an empty wine glass. She looked more closely, nearly pressing her nose to the bottle, and in the soul's wavering form, she discerned human features, warped and quickly shifting. There was a wizened mouth, and there 2 clouded eyes. "Hello," she whispered. "Can you speak?" She held the bottle up to her ear and listened.
Thank you so much, Abigail. That's such a beautiful passage, and you do such a beautiful job of reading it too. That was really lovely. So if anybody hasn't actually read this story yet, I feel like they'll be completely convinced now. And I wonder, can you tell us a little bit about the different inspirations for the magic in this story, and what parts are drawn from existing folklore and what parts are your own invention?
Well, I started writing this story my senior year of college while I was working on my thesis, which was a play about the Paper Brigade, the real life Paper Brigade, not the magazine. And I was also, and I just remember this, I was working on a term paper about the bioethical implications of Dybbuk possession and like how maybe this could have been a tactic because you're not allowed to marry or like fulfill any particular social role that is high stakes or do any life event that is high stakes while you are being possessed. And it seems also in the record of possessions that a lot of these happened right around the time that women were supposed to be getting married. So that's interesting. And so this was while I was researching that a lot and while I was doing a lot of research for my play and sort of having studied Yiddish and having studied Jewish studies throughout college, this wound up being the place where I just put all of the things I liked and the folklore I liked that I couldn't fit into my play or I couldn't fit into these other things I was doing. And I think that's a lot of how I write is that I get really into something and then I need a place to put it. So yeah, much of this is rooted in Yiddish folklore, in Ashkenazi Jewish folklore. But one thing that was interesting is that I was discussing this story with a friend of mine. I grew up in North Carolina, a friend of mine from North Carolina, who asked if it was inspired, or the aspect of the souls in bottles was inspired by bottle trees. Which is, if you have been to the South or are from the South, you have seen these. They're trees with usually blue or colorful bottles that are stuck on the branches. And this is a tradition from, I think, of what is now Democratic Republic of Congo. When people were brought over and enslaved in the South, they brought this folklore, which is that a ghost will go into a blue glass bottle in the night and then burn up in the morning. And that is how you can get rid of and manage a ghost problem. So I think, and when they asked me that, I was like, oh yeah, like, of course that's part of it. Or I think that like, it was pieces from a lot of different places in my life and a lot of where I was coming from and really immersed in at that time was Yiddish folklore, but it's not all completely from Yiddish folklore, although there is a true piece of folklore about the souls coming on the Sabbath and cooling themselves in water. But yeah, I think the folklore is all real, but the details are mine.
That's so interesting. And I love that fusion of the folklore of different cultures. It's really just fascinating. And I, as being a person not from there, I would never have known that without you saying that. And sort of on a related note to what you were mentioning before about the marriage and things like that. I mean, I think one thing that, I know that we've talked about this too, is it's so interesting to explore overlooked stories from the past, or stories that historically people wouldn't have discussed with the same like openness or even the same vocabulary as we would today. And in this case, maybe thinking specifically about the queer relationship between Hinda and Basia, could you tell us a little bit more about that relationship and how you like approached writing about it in your story?
Mhm. I think a lot of, in my experience, a lot of women who are queer or people who anyway relate to those labels have had in childhood a really intense, sort of romantic, codependent, volatile friendship with another with another young girl. And I think that like these are things that a lot of us experience, and then we sort of grow up and grow into ourselves and look back and we're like, oh, that was formative, or like that was important. But these are relationships, or these childhood relationships, that friendship doesn't quite cover, but there's not a lot of language for. And likewise, I think when we're looking at or inventing in fiction relationships in the past that we would, if we dropped these people into today's world and gave them today's language, they would call lesbian or they would call queer. Relationships that don't quite have language or aren't quite fully, sortable into labels, into categories, but are the least interesting part of them is what label we put on them. It's just like the details of that relationship are so interesting. And I think the way this relationship resolves at the end of the story sort of affirms the fact that this is not something that could even be contained by girlfriend, or even be contained by loved one. It's just a complete merging of all of these things, of all of the different ways you could relate to another person.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting too, because one thing that I thought about while I was reading your story is how that idea of possession, that someone taking possession of her, that really terrifies Hinda for a lot of the story, or that's how she almost thinks about it when she touches Basia during the wedding. She thinks, am I possessed? But then it ends up having this totally different meaning at the end, where she actually welcomes this other soul kind of merging with her own. So I really love that description of it. And I think it really reflects, Hinda's own feeling of not knowing, what exactly is going on, or not being sure. And just one last question, because I know the time is flying by and everyone already has like a million questions to ask you. And I want to get to Carol and Josh's questions as well. But those of you who are at our very first short story club meeting back in January will remember Gail van der Wouden's story Into the Mud. And Abigail, after that meeting, you told me that reading about the two protagonists in Yael's story was almost like seeing Hinda and Basia in another Gilgul, which I hope I'm pronouncing that right, which I believe in Jewish mysticism is a cycle of reincarnation. And I love that idea. It completely resonates with me as well. I completely see it. And for those of you who weren't at that meeting, I think both relationships, as Abigail has said, are sort of characterized by these elements of attraction and affection, but also resentment and a strong sense of competition. Abigail, what do you think we can sort of glean from seeing that dynamic between the characters, between different characters, or different variations of that dynamic played out in different stories across different time periods, or different mythical worlds in this case?
Oh, I think it's just fun practice in seeing ourselves and seeing ourselves in different places in different times. I don't think it's one-to-one. I don't think everyone has had a relationship like this, and I don't think everyone would respond the same way to the discussion with a soul in a bottle. But it's just one entry point, a relationship into so many different sort of combinations of human experience. And history and magic and fun things. But I love the idea of this Gilgul of these two people sort of being born again and again and again into different folkloric and historical iterations of themselves. I just think it's like seeing like a friend in different in a different context, and it takes you a minute to recognize them. That's how it felt to read that story. It was so fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with you. That's
Can I just ask a question about where the Jewish folklore, where is this idea of souls in bottles coming from?
This is a very frustrating answer, but I don't remember where exactly I read this. I've searched and searched. I need to email Gabriel Savrit, the author of The Way Back, because he also has a soul in a bottle. And I was like, where you came up with that? I came up with that. I know it's from folklore. Where the heck did we read this?
Because originally, like in India, they used to have like the genie in the bottle in India.
Yeah.
I don't know where, I've never heard of it in Jewish, folklore.
My main folklore sources, just for fun, light reading, are Lilith's Cave by Howard Schwartz, and all of those collections of Jewish fairy tales. And I have it here, the Nathaniel Deutsch, The Jewish Dark Continent, of a translation that's with a lot of footnotes and context of Shin Ansky's ethnographic expedition, where he documented so much of the folklore of the Pale of Settlement right on the edge of World War I. And this is also just like a great wealth of...
I'm sorry, could you put it in the chat or just say it again, the last thing?
The title of the book?
Yeah.
It is The Jewish Dark Continent by Nathaniel Deutsch.
Nathaniel Deutsch.
Oh, thank you, Naomi. Yes.
Thanks, Abby. Oh, thank you, Naomi. And just a reminder to everyone else, if you would like to ask any questions, I know that we're already actually seeing a million of them in the chat, but for anyone else, if you want to put it in the chat or just raise your virtual hand so we can call on you. But in the meantime, I just want to ask Josh and Carol to chime in with their own questions. And Josh, you were the primary editor of the story, so let's start with you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Abigail, for this beautiful story. You're such a great ambassador for storytelling generally. I love what you said at the start, that that The Little Bottles is a love story. I encountered it the very same way. For me, there's something beautiful that starts, and I don't want to give much away either, but earlier on in the story, Basya marries Elkhon, and there's a line, Hinda didn't like Elkhon. And as a reader, you're like, uh-oh, something is brewing here. But I want to go to a different moment in the story, if I could. This is later on in the story when Hinda's husband, Zalman, who is a very sympathetic character to me, is very frustrated. And he says to her, no one ever told you to stop believing because they all thought you'd figure it out on your own, like a normal child. You've always lived in stories. And I love that idea of living in stories. In some ways, it strikes me in this story that Basya is more of the world. She's involved in commerce. She's dealing with tradespeople and people who are workers, not well, but she's of the world. And I wonder if you could just tell us about that idea here of living in stories. This is a folk story, but it's also about these two characters. It's very much a love story. Is it better to live in stories? And how do you think about as a short story writer here that sort of conflict between being grounded and being less so?
And I think when we were talking in advance of this, Becca and Carol and I, we talked about in The Meaning of Human Existence, E.O. Wilson sort of suggests that humans gave up the innate biological understanding of how to be a bird that birds have and how to be a lizard that lizards have. Humans don't have anything that tells us how to be a human because we gave that up in exchange for storytelling. We don't have some sort of biological switch that goes off in our brain to tell us where the watering holes are. But very early on, we got griots who could tell us where the watering holes are. I had a teacher who would always say that. The poets are the ones who remembered where the watering holes are. Stories have exchanged the place in our mind of those sort of immediate, more animal awarenesses. We need stories to tell us the things that we need to know to be people. And I think that when Hinda's world is so rich in them and so claustrophobic, even with the amount of stories that take up space in her brain and her world, I think that she is richer for that. And I evaluate the success of this story because there's someone in the audience who told me that after reading it, they think twice now, or they get a little nervous, like when they leave water open, which is great for hygiene. And I wonder if that was the sort of origin of this folklore. Don't leave your water out open, or else souls will get inside it. But I could think of no higher praise than I have given a person a new neurosis upon reading this. But really, like a new story to sort of fill empty space, fill some part of the air around them, make it crowded.
Such a beautiful and thoughtful answer. Thank you.
Carol, Carol, you're muted, but I don't know if you want to jump in. Oh, Carol, you're still muted.
Oh,
No, you got it.
Got it. Hi, Abigail. Hi, everybody. Also a big fan of your story and every aspect of it. I was struck by another similarity between your story and Into the Mud, which is that even though both take place in what appears to be a shtetl, the thing that often, maybe always, accompanies shtetl stories is anti-Semitism. And in both your story and Yael's, there's no mention of that. And I would love to hear your thoughts about why that is in your story.
Yeah. Well, again, this is a thing where I think that like anti-Semitism was, I mean, the shtetl, or like the idea we have of a shtetl is like 100% like Jewish world, when of course there are other people in this town who are not Jews. It's just they're not main characters in the story, so we don't hear about them. And there was anti-Semitism that, certainly economically and probably interpersonally affected these main characters' lives, but I think it's not really a part of the story. So it's the least interesting thing about what's happening to these people, that it's not worth mentioning. And I think there's at least one person in the audience who can get me the name of the academic who says this, but a backshadowing. When we read stories that take place in sort of this mythopoetic shtetl in any sort of pre-war Europe, you're writing these stories or creating the stories, you're already fighting your audience. Your audience has to push through the Holocaust to get to the stories, has to get around the Holocaust somewhere to go back to get to this story. And people approach that in different ways and address that in different ways. But it is a hard thing, I think that like there's a reaction or like a part of the brain, and I hope I'm not like projecting onto the audience, but I think a common thing that happens is like after reading the story, the brain of the American modern day reader is like, I wonder what happened to these people during the Holocaust. And I think that like that's, makes sense that people have that thought or like have that reaction because it was a big traumatic event. But that's also like, I think seeing it through the lens of the Holocaust or through the lens of anti-Semitism worrying about what happens at the end of this story or at the end of this civilization, instead of focusing on the love that's happening in it, I think is sort of a devaluation of the love that is happening within it. David Roski, backshot. Is that right?
I had the thought that also setting this story in kind of fantasy allows you to add or eliminate whatever you want. And you had no use for anti-Semitism in this story. Forget the Holocaust. That was, yeah, that's the backshadowing. We actually had a Paper Brigade article by Moriel Rothman-Zecher. Is that how you say it? That it very interestingly discussed the idea of backshadowing and how. Anyway, thank you. That was
no. Just to jump in, Carol, Abby, as you were talking, I thought that this is also very interesting because I think it's in the same issue of Paper Brigade that your short story was published in. We had an article by Moriel, as Carol said, about how different novels have also used magic to sort of, the presence of magic to sort of eliminate backshadowing. So to sort of like as a way of sort of saying, oh, but this inevitable possibility isn't maybe the inevitable possibility, that this is sort of set in an alternate universe where you can forget about that. So Naomi actually, I think, put the link to that in the chat if anybody would like to read that article. I think it's a really fascinating concept.
Yeah. Or sorry, if I could speak to that. Yeah, I maybe like completely pushing aside in my treatment of the story, pushing aside and ignoring anti-Semitism was an overreaction. Maybe it was right for this story. Maybe there are different strategies I could have used, but I think the important thing was that people have to go into this story believing that anything is possible and that anything can happen. And I think when we can use sort of fantasy and magic to help people get there and help people practice that, because then when people look at the past, look at any particular moment in the past, they have to view that moment as a moment in which anything could have happened. And I think that's very important to practice and important to look at history that way, and Jewish history, any history, fantasy, whatever. So we can also look at the present that way. And so we can also look at the future that way. And we can only do that when we stop backshadowing. And I think it is great to see people discussing it, and it is important to practice.
Yeah, that's so well said. And actually I can see people writing here like, yes, agree. So I think that's like perfectly articulated. And I know that we're almost at 1, but we'll stay on for a few more minutes because I definitely want to get some more questions from the crowd. Abby, you're so fascinating that I feel like this time is just flying by. But I did see one question in the chat. Someone asked, why is there that, I'm sorry, I lost who asked it, but they said, why is there the moment of negativity between Basya and Hinda at the wedding? It was Lori Feldman, by the way.
Hinda is having a bad time at the wedding. And I think it's just a moment of overwhelm and a moment of like, oh, I have all these feelings and I can't handle it. But I think it's also sort of a foreshadowing instead of backshadowing. Foreshadowing is allowed of sort of the what is going to happen at the end of touch is important in this story, and not being able to touch when that's not possible, when you're a soul and a human. I think that just the intensity of that and the power of that is very much when you're just trying to have a bad time at a social event.
Exactly. And Abigail, on a related note, Meryl R asks, I want to know what happens to Hinda after the end of this story. Do you know?
I know with absolute certainty that she's going to be okay and that she's going to have a great time.
It's always nice to hear.
Nothing bad happens after the end of the story.
That is wonderful. That's what we want to hear. A happy ending is always good. And Lori says also thank you, and so does Meryl. Thank you for that answer. That's exactly what we want to hear. I think we've all felt very invested in these characters. So, another question that Sophia is asking is that you mentioned that you started working on this in college, and since it was published a couple of years ago, do you think about anything in particular when you revisit it now?
When I revisited it this morning, I was like, oh God, I wish I had written down like all of my sources for all these pieces of folklore. But I don't know, I feel proud of it. And Sophia saw an early draft of this, I believe. I think about sort of just the excitement and just the burst of energy that went into it. And you know, I feel grateful for all of the support I received around it. And I guess that's what I think. I think good things.
Well, that is wonderful to hear. And by the way, I'm seeing a lot of people all just writing in the chat about how much they loved this story and all of this extreme positivity towards it. So I just wanted to throw that out there too. And I think I'll just have like one last question, because I think it's such a nice question to end on, is that Evie had asked what stories or books that you read as a child really made the most impact on you.
That is a good question. And while I'm thinking about that, Miri Dalber has found the source of the folklore of the souls quoted in My Mother's Sabbath Days, which I think absolutely makes sense because I would have read that around the time I was reading this. So thank you. Thank you for this amazing information. Well worth a reread. I love that book. Hein Grade. Things that made an impression on me as a child. James Thurber, The 13 Clocks, was one I read obsessively, and it felt so, I just loved the language of it and like the playfulness of the language and the fairy tale of it. That was a favorite. The Ursula Le Guin Earthsea books. I liked fantasy. I don't know if that's probably obvious. I think those were big ones for me.
Absolutely. And I remember also you mentioned that didn't your childhood rabbi, I remember we were talking about this, that your childhood rabbi also was this amazing storyteller as well.
Yeah.
Which was really interesting.
Yeah, he was an amazing oral storyteller. He never had a written script. And he would just tell stories of the Talmud and the Gada very beautifully. And that was an enormous influence for me to just hear him tell stories, and that allowed me also to grow up in a way that was in a world that was really crowded with stories, and very early on gave
similar
me
to Hinda in this story, perhaps. Well, thank you so much, Abigail. This was really just so fascinating and so wonderful. And thank you also to everyone who joined us today. If you enjoyed this conversation and you'd like to read more of Paper Brigade, we're posting the link to purchase the double 2020-2021 issue and the discount code again. I'd also like to encourage you to support us by becoming a JBC member. Our mission at Jewish Book Council is to educate and enrich the community through Jewish literature. We're a small nonprofit, and support from readers like you is really crucial to our initiatives. As I mentioned, this is sadly the last Short Story Club meeting of the year, but it's been such a true pleasure to have you all join us over the past months. And I definitely hope that you'll stay tuned for more JBC events on the horizon. Thank you again and have a wonderful summer.